our friend Jay Humbard.
Normally I have a little computer that I keep this on, and I went off and got about a third of the way here and realized I left it on the kitchen counter. But fortunately, I always print out a backup copy just in case. So that paid off this time. Let's just have a real quick prayer. Dear Lord, I can feel your spirit in this place, and draw close to each and every one of us here. Bless this gathering, and let every word that be said to your glory. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I appreciate the opportunity to come over here, I used to in Pittsburgh we had one pastor and 4 churches, so it was kind of rare to get a real pastor in our church. So if you were an elder down there, you got a lot of practice at preaching. We did have a retired pastor there, which was kind of nice. That really made it a tolerable arrangement. But when I was little, my dad built houses. He was a house builder. And so we frequently moved, because if he had a house that he couldn't sell, guess where we were going to live for the next couple of years? And sometimes he would build one, and for whatever reason it wouldn't sell, and we would just move into that house. So we hopped from house to house, and he did all right as a builder. He was not some big construction conglomerate. He built a couple of houses at a time and kept going like that. And this was in the 1970s, and I'm sure many of you have seen houses that were built in that area, but they tended to have 2 living rooms. We had a front room, a living room in the front, in the house that we spent most of my formative years in. And we had a room in the front, and that was called the front room. And Mom had the nice couch in there and the nice furniture in there. And then we had a room in the back called the family room, and that was where things were a little more relaxed. So in the front room was where the new furniture wound up, and as soon as the furniture got a little bit thread-worn or whatever, we moved them to the back room. Now, I was a little boy. I was 9 or 10 years old, and there was all kinds of construction going on all around. So I would play outdoors and get kind of dirty, You can probably imagine a little boy and a bunch of construction equipment. And I would come in, and one of the first things my mama would say is, "Don't you go in the living room. You're all dirty. You need to stay out of the living room where the nice furniture is." And I had an old basset hound who was kind of my sidekick, and he went everywhere with me. And in the family room, I could sit on the couch, I could eat snacks and watch TV, and everything was really relaxed, and the old dog could even sit up on the couch with me, and he'd hop right up there on the couch and sit with me. But even the dog knew that dogs do not get on the couch in the living room. That was just the way it was. There was 2 sets of rules, one for the living room, which was kind of fussy. I was a little boy, and it seemed fussy to me. And then the family room, where everything was all relaxed and a lot of fun. And sometimes we have rules for good reasons. My mom liked to have people over, and she wanted to have a nice place to have her friends over. Sometimes my dad would have customers over, and we needed a nice place for them to spread out the house plans and look at the house they were going to build. So there was some sense behind it, and it's good to have rules, isn't it? But sometimes we get carried away with this idea of rules. Rules are sort of a slippery slope, aren't they? Because it seems like once we get a rule, then we get kind of proud that we keep this rule, and pride enters into it, and Paul had something to say about that in one of his epistles. But that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, in the 5th chapter of John, there's a story that we all probably have heard. Jesus is going about in his ministry, and he comes into Jerusalem, and And he heads down to a place that they say in Hebrew is called Siloam, the pool of Siloam. And the pool of Bethesda. Got two sermons mixed up there. He goes down to this place called the pool of Bethesda. And this place, the pool of Bethesda, is kind of like a hospital in a way. I mean, the sick people come to this pool and they wait around this pool, and supposedly an angel comes down and stirs the water, and if you're quick enough and the first one to jump in, then you'll be healed of whatever it is that afflicts you. You know, they didn't have like medical centers in those days and doctors and modern medicine. And, you know, a lot of times we just read right through that part because the good part comes next. But let's stop and think about that part just for a minute. That's kind of weird, isn't it? That this angel comes down and stirs the water, and the most able-bodied of the infirmed, if he can get to the water quick enough, he'll get healed. It's like it's a competitive thing, you know, and it's like it's kind of weird supernatural thing. You know, it really is out of place in the Bible. Out of place in the way Jesus goes through his ministry, and yet the passage just sort of flows right through this. The story just sort of flows through this odd sort of place where we have all these suffering people, these sick people. And we were driving over here and we were talking about how, you know, the world is full of people like this. The world is full of suffering people and sick people and people who have loved ones who are sick and people who are struggling themselves and people who have, they called them demons, I'll call them demons. You know, people have emotional issues and they struggle with them. And they aren't all gathered around the pool of Bethesda, they're everywhere, right? There's probably some right here in this church. There's undoubtedly some, you see them. I saw a fellow sitting in a parking lot over in Overland Park, and he had a sign. He was a rough-looking guy, and he had a sign. He said, "No work, no food, need a miracle." And what do you think when you see somebody like that? I mean, you think, you know, he's probably addicted to something, or he has some problem. But the reality of the situation is, he's like these people that are around this pool of Bethesda, isn't it? And they're all there waiting for a miracle. They're all there for it's almost like, you know, the angel moves the water and Johnny Donovan on the talk show soundtrack says, "Come on down," and somebody comes down and gets a miracle. It's kind of weird. And it's in this story, and it flows right through this story. And I got to wonder, what kind of angel was that? Was that a good angel or was that a bad angel? It's just a little too strange that God would set this thing up that only the strongest and the best would be able to benefit from this miracle. So they wait. They call it a porch. And Ron Carlson gave a sermon on this, and he said he had been to Jerusalem and he had actually seen this place, and he said it was quite big, the ruins of this place. And there were multiple porches, and the people sat there on the porches hoping to get in the water, and you had to, like everything in our world, you had to have a little money to be able to get there. You know, if you were really disabled, how were you going to get to the water quick? Well, you had to hire a fella to take you to the water, and you better hire the strongest, fastest fella there so he could grab you and throw you in right at the right minute, or you weren't gonna. This wasn't going to work out. And so most of the people, they sat there on the porch, and there's no healing for them on the porch. They just sat there. So in our story here, it says, starting in verse 3 of John chapter 5, it says, "Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" You know, such a simple question. Do you want to get well? Now, this pool of Bethesda is in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital city of God's people. This was the spot on earth where you would expect to find miracles and the people of God and compassion and mercy and healing and all of those things. And here is this guy. He's been on the porch of this kind of spooky paranormal thing for 38 years trying to get healed. 38 years. Think about that. How many of you in here, have been an adult for 38 years? I know there's some of us in here who have, but that kind of cuts it down, quite a lot. I bet there's people in here. I know there's people in here who haven't even been alive 38 years. I haven't quite been married 38 years. But it's a lifetime. 38 years is a long, long time. And what does this place Bethesda mean? Bethesda, it says it's in Hebrew called Bethesda in the Bible. And if you Google that, Bethesda means a house of healing, a house of mercy in Hebrew. Now, isn't it a little weird that Bethesda, this house of mercy, this spooky paranormal kind of thing, happens to be right next door to the temple in Jerusalem. So the people now think about this. So the people in Jerusalem, they go down to this kind of paranormal thing, looking for instant miracles. And it's called the place of mercy or the house of mercy. And what's it right next door to? God's temple. Now, why do they call this place the house of mercy? And they don't call God's temple the house of mercy. The Spirit of God is in this temple, or at least was at one time. And next door to it is this house of mercy. And right between the two, there's this thing called the sheep's gate. You didn't want to go through the sheep gate if you were a sheep, because that was where they led the sheep in to be slaughtered for the sacrifices at the temple. And by the way, the temple had become basically a place of business and a den of thieves. I mean, they had their own currency system. So if you were coming from the country to worship and you wanted to pay your tithe, well, you had to go see the money changers over here and change your money to temple currency and probably get ripped off and then go pay your temple tithe. And by the way, if you brought your own sheep, the priest might look at it and say, well, you're supposed to bring a lamb without blemish. That one has a little lamb with a little blemish there. But my cousin over here, he's got some good sheep. You go see him over at those tables over there. So this spooky paranormal place called Bethesda has become the den of mercy to the people. And the temple, God's holy temple, has become this place where they know they're going to get ripped off if they go there. This is the scene. This is the part that we got to keep in mind as we look at this story, because Jesus walks right into this thing. He walks into this place and he looks at this, right next to the sheep gate, and he looks at all these suffering people. And I don't know why he didn't just say to all of them, you're healed. You're free. Get up. I have no earthly idea, why he chose this man. I don't think that for a minute that Jesus didn't realize that this man had been afflicted for 38 years. But Jesus walks in his mercy into this place that the locals called mercy. And and finds this man who had been an infirm for 38 years. That's just an awful long time. And he says to this man, he says, "Do you wish to get well?" What a simple question. What a simple question to a poor guy who's been sitting here. How did he get to the place every day? I don't know. Did he have to be carried there every day by family members? There's an awful lot in this story we don't know. But we do know that this poor guy had been sitting here for this long, and Jesus just comes right up and says this. An awful lot of people are like this guy. They keep coming and doing the same thing over and over again, hoping to buy a ticket. How many times have you been in a gas station or something and you've seen somebody buying a lottery ticket and they're down and out? You can tell, boy, they probably ought to spend this money on, there's a lot of better things they could spend this money on than a lottery ticket, but they're there, they're looking for this instant miracle, this instant cure to all their problems. And so people keep repeating the same old mistakes over and over again. For 38 years, this fella had come and bought a lottery ticket at the pool of Bethesda. Like I said, the thing that amazes me about these Bible stories is, the details are a little different, but the story is the same, isn't it? The story is exactly the same, 2,000 years ago and today, because the people are basically the same. So a lot of people, they'll hang on to a grudge they had. Somebody did something to me when I was 25 years old, and I'm mad at that person. And I may be 60 now, 60-something now, but I remember that person did me wrong. I'm going to hold a grudge against that person. 38 years, this poor fella had been suffering with this. And he says to Jesus, because this is his lucky day, Jesus walks up to him and he says to Jesus, "Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. When I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down there ahead of me." Well, isn't that just life? He's right here. He can't even scratch the stuff off of his lottery ticket. And he didn't have a nickel or a penny to scratch the stuff off his lottery ticket. And this Jesus walks up and says, "You want to be well?" Just like that. You want to be well? And Jesus says to him, I love how Jesus does these things. He just says to him, "Well, get up, pick up your mat and walk." Just like that. Boom, 38 years. It says at once the man was cured. And he picked up his mat and he walked. Can you imagine being this man? This man went here just like he did every other day for 38 years. And I'm pretty sure he didn't figure he was going to get in the pool that day. And I'm very sure he didn't figure some stranger was going to walk up to him and just say, "Oh, you want to be well? Get up, you're healed." And boom, all of a sudden his legs work. And he gets up, He didn't even know who had done this. He was paralyzed yesterday and for the last 38 years, and now all of a sudden this guy's standing up looking at all these other poor people who he's been hanging out with for the last couple of decades. And he's free. We talk a lot about being free from the debt of this, or Paul talks an awful lot about being free from sin or free from slavery. This guy's free. All of a sudden, he didn't even know who it was who had healed him. Just some stranger. Now, of course, there was a little problem with this, right? Jesus happened upon this guy, and what day was it when he came upon this guy? It was a Sabbath day. And I'm sure you all know this. I'm preaching to the choir, but the Jews had a lot of rules for the Sabbath. There were certain things you weren't supposed to do on the Sabbath day. You weren't supposed to sow. You weren't supposed to plow. You weren't supposed to reap. You weren't supposed to bind your sheaves together. You weren't supposed to thresh or winnow or grind or sift or knead. And the list went on and on and on. But one of the things on the list was kindling a fire. Yeah, you weren't supposed to kindle a fire. If you were an adherent Jew, you had to hire a dirty old Gentile to come in and light your candles for you on the Sabbath, or get them going before the Sabbath and keep them going. You know, you were not supposed to do these things. And one other thing on the list was transporting a burden. Now, Jesus strolls into this hospital. I'm going to put hospital in quotes if you don't mind. Into this weird, whatever, supernatural hospital. And he says to this guy, "You're healed, pick up your mat and walk." And the guy picks up his mat, and I bet he didn't walk. I bet that guy ran. I mean, if you'd been stuck for 38 years and suddenly your legs worked, you would take off, wouldn't you? It'd be like when you've been on a long trip and you open the door and the dog gets out of the car. Man, he takes off and he runs around the car 2 or 3 times. Because I bet this fella felt like that. You know, he could walk. He didn't know if this guy was some preacher or some minister or miracle worker. He was obviously a miracle worker. All of a sudden, this guy could walk. And it was the Sabbath. And he was in Jerusalem. And he wasn't just in Jerusalem. He was in Jerusalem, and he was right next door to the temple. Now, if you were going to go anywhere in Jerusalem, and you were or in a town, and you wanted to meet the people who would probably care in Jerusalem, if you were doing something on the Sabbath, you would probably go hang out by the temple, wouldn't you? Because by the temple, in the temple is all the Pharisees and all the Sadducees and all the knowledgeable people and experts in the law, and they keep track of these things. And here's this guy. They probably all knew this guy. He'd been hanging out here for 38 years right next door. Here's this guy suddenly running down the street carrying his bed. This is not good. This is not good. It's a little bit like if Starbucks put in a Starbucks thing and it was like right next door to the Adventist church, and you were going to church on Sabbath and you really wanted a latte. But it's right next door to the church, just down the road a little ways. And if you get in that drive-through line, and there's quite a few cars in line, there's a pretty good chance one of the brothers from the church is going to drive by and see your car waiting in line at that Starbucks to get a latte on Sabbath. This is a situation here. This guy's right here. Jesus said, "Take up your bed on the Sabbath, right next door to the temple." And what happened next? If you look in verse 12, says, "So they asked him, 'Who is this fellow who told you to pick up and walk?'" Because he tells the guys, "Look, I'm just walking because some guy healed me and he told me to take my bed and walk, and I wasn't going to argue with him because suddenly I'm healed. Who was this fellow who asked you to walk?" And the man said, it says the man had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd. This is a good story. I love this story because it kind of shows how God works. You know, Jesus a lot of times, he kind of showed these people how they were in a special way. You know, Jesus could have walked up to this guy. He could have said to the guy, "You know, I could heal you, but it is a Sabbath. And you've been here for 38 years already. If you hang out here just a little longer, right after sunset, I'll come by and I'll heal you." He could have said that, couldn't he? And we might have been tempted to say that if we were in that situation, you know. We might just be tempted to say, "Well, I know it'd be a good thing to do, but it is the Sabbath, and I probably shouldn't do this." And Jesus could have done that, couldn't he? But he didn't. You know, he could have said, "Well, I'm going to go ahead and heal you, and you get up and you leave, and this old mat that you've been sleeping on for 38 years, it's nothing really special anyway. Now you can go get a job and you can get yourself a really nice mat. Just leave that mat there." He could have said that too, but he didn't. No, he didn't do that. You see, what had happened was the Sabbath to the Jewish people had become kind of like that nice couch in my mom's old living room. It was this fussy thing with all kinds of rules that you had to obey and comply with. You know, You didn't dare go in there and sit down and have a snack. Mama caught you, you'd be in big trouble. The dog even knew not to go in there and lay on the couch. He wouldn't go in there. You couldn't even get that dog to lay on that couch because he knew it'd get Mom mad. The Sabbath was supposed to be a day of peace and joy and remembering God and all the great things He'd done in our lives, and a memorial to creation. And then came the rules. And then came the guys who made a living selling you the rules. And then the temple, which was supposed to be the place of mercy, became a business. Can you see how human nature just ruined all this stuff? And right next door to the temple, there was presumably some dark angel running this weird supernatural paranormal healing thing. And this was called the House of Mercy, right next door to God's church, right next door to the General Conference headquarters building. And this was the situation. Did you ever see the little soap? When I was a little boy, my mom had these soaps in a little jar in the bathroom, and they were fancy little soaps, and they smelled real nice, but I knew not to use those either. Those soaps were for special occasion. They were for guests. I always wanted to use one of those soaps. I don't know why. Once in a while, my grandma would let me use one, because I think she got it. But it would have been real easy for Jesus to rationalize that I could just wait a couple of hours and come back and heal this guy. I could come back on Sunday and heal this guy because he's going to be here. But he didn't do that. The principle of the Sabbath had been lost in the rules, hadn't it? The principle of the Sabbath was noble and good and pure and wonderful, and it was empowering, and it lifted people up, and the rules drug it down. And it's important for us to realize that Jesus chose this event. This didn't just happen. He didn't wander aimlessly around and these things happened to him. He chose to meet this man on this day in this place right next door to the temple and heal him on the Sabbath. This really made the Pharisees mad. If you go down a couple of more verses, verse 14, it says, later Jesus found him at the temple. Yeah, and Jesus even chose, by the way, to get his name attached to this, because it said, later Jesus found this guy at the temple and said, see, you're well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. So Jesus could have snuck away even and just let the guy be healed. He'd already done the merciful thing and healed the guy. But no, he chose every bit of this. And the man went away and told the Jewish leaders who it was. And I think Jesus probably knew this was what was going to happen. He planned all this out. So Jesus made sure that the Jewish leaders knew who it was that had healed this man on the Sabbath and told him to take up his bed. That was a double strike. And so it says later on, it says, so because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. This was the beginning of the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. Why was that? Because he was making the guys who are making a lot of money off of this mad. These Jewish leaders, they lived a lavish life. I mean, we wouldn't probably consider it that lavish. We live a lavish life compared to everybody that came before us, the truth is. But to them, they lived so much nicer of a life than the ordinary people that, it was like the beautiful people now who build rockets and fly themselves into space. We can't hardly imagine how those people live. And ordinary people then couldn't hardly imagine how the temple leaders lived. It all gets lost when it becomes all about rules and not about principles. And these Jewish leaders who were in God's temple, the beautiful temple that Solomon had built, spent their time from that day forward trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus, the Son of God. This is what actually happened that day. The hand of the Pharisees was turned against him, And the supposed spiritual leaders of Israel were now plotting to kill the Son of God and the Messiah. Human nature is just sinful. Paul says, what a wretched man am I. And I think if we're honest, every one of us is that same way. Every one of us has thought that at some point in our life, if we really look at ourselves and say, why did I do that? What possessed me to do that? And as parents, we've watched our kids grow up, and sometimes they're so sweet and perfect when they're little, They can do no wrong, and then later on you have to sit back and watch them do these things, and it isn't going to turn out good. And all you can do is sit and watch, and you realize, gosh, this must be just how God feels watching me. God must have felt this way 1,000 times in my life. This isn't going to come out well, but we crave rules, don't we? We like things to be simple. And principles are a lot more complicated than rules, because principles can be interpreted. And I might interpret the principle different than you, and I might think my interpretation of the principle is better than your interpretation of the principle. And because I am so desperately sinful, the next thing I'm going to think is, well, that guy, he's got a problem. He's not keeping the Sabbath the way I think he ought to keep the Sabbath. I'm better than he is because I'm keeping the Sabbath the right, proper way. And there we go. And we're right back at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, the place that's called Mercy, that's right next door to the General Conference headquarters of God's church. Paul said it so clearly in Romans 3. He said, none is righteous, not one. No one understands. No one speaks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Wow. What a condemnation that is. And our pride becomes the whitewash on the tomb of all the things that we do and all the evil thoughts that we think. And rules make it much easier for us to cultivate that pride. At the pool of Bethesda, Jesus was really giving all of us a warning message, a message that still applies today, thousands of years later. That's the amazing thing about these stories in the Bible. They are still true today. We need to remember the principles behind the rules. And I think as Adventists, we are maybe in a little more danger of falling into the rules than some of the other churches. The lawlessness is bad, no doubt about that. But our human nature being what it is, we can get obsessed with being lawful, can't we? And that's just as bad. Look how it ended up there in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Father, I ask that you be with each and every person here today as they leave this blessed home of yours on this wonderful Sabbath day. Keep them safe, keep them under your wing, and bring them back next Sabbath to once again worship you and praise the holy name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.